Part 1. Discarded. The suitcase had belonged to Eleanor's mother. It was a pale blue hardshell Samsonite, the kind they stopped making sometime in the 1960s, and for 50 years it had sat in the back of a closet doing nothing more than collecting the quiet dust of a life well settled. The handle had cracked at some point, Eleanor couldn't remember when, and she had wrapped it with a length of brown twine, 2 loops, and a knot, the kind of repair her husband Raymond would have called good enough to last another decade. Raymond had been wrong about a lot of things. He had been right about that. On the morning of November 15th, 2019, Eleanor Hayes stood on the sidewalk outside the house where she had lived for 40 years with that suitcase at her feet and 2 cardboard boxes stacked beside it. The November air came off Lake Champlain, cold and flat and indifferent the way Vermont air does in the weeks before the first hard freeze. She wore her gray wool coat, the one with the loose button on the second eyelet that she had been meaning to sew back for 3 months. She had not sewn it back. There had always been tomorrow for things like that. The door of the house closed behind her with a sound she would remember for the rest of her life. Not a slam. That would have been almost easier to bear. It was a careful, deliberate click, the sound of someone making sure the latch caught properly. She was 70 years old. She had $56.38 in her coat pocket. She had nowhere to go. Cars moved past on the street without slowing. A woman walking a retriever on the opposite sidewalk glanced at Eleanor and then looked away with the particular efficiency of someone who has decided not to know what they are seeing. The sky above Burlington was the color of old pewter uniform, and lo, the kind of sky that means business. Eleanor did not cry. She had spent most of the previous 2 weeks crying alone in the bedroom she had shared with Raymond for 4 decades, and she had arrived at a place on the other side of tears where things were simply very clear and very cold. She looked at the suitcase. She looked at the boxes. She looked at the house. Then she began to figure out what came next. To understand what happened on that sidewalk, you have to understand what had happened in the 3 years before it. Raymond Hayes died of pancreatic cancer in the autumn of 2016, which is a brutal way for a good man to go, and he went the way he had lived quietly without complaint, concerned primarily about what he was leaving behind. He left Eleanor the house outright, paid off no mortgage, hers completely. He also left her his watch, a Bulova his father had given him when he turned 21, and a life insurance policy that paid out enough to cover 2 years of property taxes and utilities if she was careful. Raymond had not been a wealthy man. He had been a careful one, and in Eleanor's experience, that was worth considerably more. For 3 years after Raymond died, Eleanor managed. She did not do it easily, but she did it. Her Social Security came to $1,200 monthly, which in Burlington, Vermont in 2019 was not enough to cover taxes, utilities, groceries, and the accumulating small repairs that an old house demanded with the quiet insistence of a creditor who knows you cannot avoid him forever. The roof over the back bedroom had developed a soft spot. The furnace ran on borrowed time. The gutters needed replacing. She did not ask her children for help. This was not pride exactly. It was something more structural than pride. Eleanor Hayes had been the person other people leaned on for so long that the idea of reversing that direction felt physically wrong, like trying to make a river run uphill. Her son Daniel was 45 and lived in Shelburne with his wife and 2 teenage boys in a house that cost 4 times what Eleanor's house had cost when she and Raymond bought it. He worked in commercial real estate development, which Eleanor understood to mean that he made substantial money helping other people buy and sell buildings. And he was good at it in the way that certain people are good at things that require them to see value, where others see only structure and square footage. Her daughter Claire was 42 and lived in South Burlington, a kindergarten teacher married to an accountant named Greg. Claire was gentle in the way that people who have learned gentleness as a defense mechanism are gentle, soft on the surface, careful underneath, always slightly deferring to whoever in the room seemed most certain. They were both good at their lives. Eleanor had made sure of that. She had given them everything she had when they were young, and they had taken it and built well with it, and she did not regret a single thing she had given them. 6 months before the morning on the sidewalk, Daniel had come to Sunday dinner and raised what he called a practical matter. "Mom," he said, "if something happens to you, the house goes through probate. That takes months, sometimes over a year. Legal fees, court costs. It doesn't make sense when there's a simple solution." The simple solution was this: Eleanor would add both Daniel and Claire to the deed, a joint tenancy arrangement. If Eleanor died, the house transferred to them immediately cleanly without legal entanglement. "We're family," Daniel said. "This is just paperwork." Eleanor had listened and thought about it and decided that he was right. He was her son. He knew about real estate. It was just paperwork. She signed it the following week at a title company office downtown. The paralegal was a young woman who asked Eleanor 3 times if she understood what she was signing, which Eleanor found slightly condescending at the time. She understood later that the young woman had seen this before. 5.5 months after Eleanor signed the paperwork, Daniel and Claire arrived at the house together on a Tuesday morning with a real estate agent named Philip, who wore a fleece vest and carried a leather portfolio and had the practiced, painless visceral of a man who had delivered bad news enough times to have made peace with his own role in it. They sat in the living room. Eleanor had made tea. The tea sat untouched on the coffee table. "Mom," Daniel said, "we need to have an honest conversation about your situation." The honest conversation went like this: the house was too much for Eleanor to maintain alone. She was 70 years old. The roof needed work. The furnace was aging. It wasn't safe. They had found a wonderful assisted living facility in Williston with a private room, meals, activities, and medical support. The cost was $3,000 monthly. Daniel and Claire had already spoken to a buyer for the house, a developer interested in the lot who had offered $485,000. The sale would fund Eleanor's care for years. "When do I have to be out?" Eleanor asked. "The buyer wants possession by the 15th, Daniel said. "That's 2 weeks." And that was when Eleanor Hayes discovered the weight of a document she had signed 6 months earlier, believing it was just paperwork. She asked them to wait. She went upstairs to the bedroom she had shared with Raymond and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time holding his watch. The Bulova, his father had given it to him. She had given it to herself when he died because she could not bear to put it in a drawer. Then she came back downstairs and told him she would not go. What followed was not a conversation. It was Daniel explaining in the measured tones of a man who had already consulted a lawyer that the house was legally his and Claire's, that Eleanor's name was no longer on the deed, that if she refused to leave voluntarily, the legal remedy available to them was eviction. He did not say this with cruelty. He said it the way he said everything, with the flat efficiency of someone who has already done the math. "We love you, Mom," Claire said quietly, not quite meeting Eleanor's eyes. Eleanor looked at her daughter for a long moment. "I know you believe that," she said. That was all she said. She had 2 weeks. She spent those 2 weeks packing what she could carry, giving away what she could not, and arriving at a clarity about her situation that felt less like defeat and more like the moment in a long illness when you finally understand the diagnosis and can begin to deal with it honestly. She called 3 assisted living facilities. None would take her without a cosigner and a deposit she did not have. She called an attorney who told her that the deed transfer had been legal and properly executed, and that contesting it would require money she did not possess for a case she was unlikely to win. On November 15th, a moving truck arrived at 7 in the morning to empty the house for the new owner. Daniel and Claire were not there. They had arranged this by phone. At 10:30, Eleanor stood on the sidewalk. The pale blue Samsonite, the 2 cardboard boxes, the gray wool coat with the loose button, $56.38. She had been standing there for perhaps 20 minutes when she noticed the newspaper. Someone had discarded a copy of that morning's Burlington Free Press in the wire trash can, bolted to the light pole near the curb. Eleanor reached in and retrieved it, not entirely sure why. Old habit, perhaps. Raymond had read the paper every morning of his adult life front to back, even in the years when the news was uniformly grim. He said it was important to know what was happening in the world, even when what was happening was discouraging. She folded back the sections until she reached the classifieds. Near the bottom of the page, a box bordered in thin black lines read, "County Surplus Property. Auction today, 2 p.m. Chittenden County Administration Building. Minimum bid $1. Eleanor read the listing twice. The county was liquidating condemned and tax delinquent properties. 23 parcels. Sold as is, no warranties, payment due immediately. She looked at the $56 in her pocket. She looked at the house behind her, at its curtains already drawn by someone else, already beginning to belong to a different story. And she made a decision that by every reasonable measure made no sense at all. The county administration building was a low brick structure on Main Street. that smelled of old carpet and institutional coffee, the smell of government functioning at moderate efficiency, neither urgently nor lazily, just steadily as it had for decades. Eleanor arrived at 1:45, dragging the Samsonite, the two boxes balanced precariously on top. The auction was in a basement conference room. By the time she found it following hand-lettered signs taped to the walls, the room held perhaps 30 people. Nearly all of them, men between 40 and 60, wearing the particular uniform of real estate investors, good boots, practical jackets, the look of people who spent their days measuring the gap between what things were worth and what they could be bought for. They spoke loudly and knew each other by name. They talked about other auctions, about properties they had flipped, about the state of the Burlington housing market with the easy fluency of people for whom this was routine. Eleanor found a folding chair in the back corner and sat down. Several of the men glanced at her. Their eyes moved across her in a way without stopping, the way eyes move across things that register as irrelevant. The auctioneer was a man named Donald Pierce, heavy-set and efficient, who had the quick, confident delivery of someone who had done this specific thing enough times that he could do it well without thinking about it too hard. He called the room to order at 2 o'clock exactly. The first 21 properties went fast. A commercial lot in the New North End went for $62,000. A house with foundation damage went for $38,000. A half-acre parcel with drainage problems went for $9,000. The investors bid sharply, driving prices up from the opening dollar with the precision of people who had done their homework beforehand. Eleanor watched and learned. The process was simple. Pierce described the property. Bidding started at $1. The room decided what it was worth. After 90 minutes, Pierce shuffled his papers and looked up with the expression of a man approaching the final item on a list he was glad to see ending. All right, folks, second to last. Property number 22. He paused. His voice took on a tone that Eleanor would later recognize as theatrical skepticism, the tone of a man who wanted the room to understand that what came next was not his fault. Property number 22 is located at the terminus of Timber Ridge Road, approximately 12 miles outside the city limits. Structure is a single-family dwelling of approximately 1,200 square feet, original construction, circa 1871. A few people in the room chuckled. A house from 1871 at a county-condemned auction was either a curiosity or a catastrophe, and everyone in the room knew which was more likely. Pierce continued. No electricity, no running water, non-functional septic, significant roof damage, broken windows throughout, foundation issues, extensive mold, condemned by the county inspector, recommended for demolition. Access via unmaintained forestry road, impassable in winter conditions. No neighboring structures within a mile. He looked up from his notes. There is also, as a bonus feature, an active family of raccoons currently occupying the kitchen. The room laughed, not politely, genuinely the way people laugh when something confirms what they already suspected. So, Pierce said, setting down his papers and folding his hands with mock ceremony, who would like to open bidding on this fine property at $1 silence? Complete silence of the kind that rooms full of 30 people very rarely produce. Pierce waited, smiled. No takers, it's a steal, folks. Historic structure, old-growth timber, raccoon included free of charge. More laughter, still no bids. Pierce shrugged and began to reach for his gavel to pass to the final property. $5. The voice came from the back corner. Every head in the room turned. Eleanor Hayes was standing up holding a $5 bill. Her hand was steady, her face was composed. She looked like a woman who had thought carefully about what she was doing, which she had. Pierce squinted toward the back of the room. I'm sorry, did someone bid $5? I did, Eleanor said. $5 for property number 22. The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then the laughter started again, but different this time. Louder, less amused, and more. Eleanor would think about this later, more revealing. The laughter of people who have encountered something they cannot categorize and have chosen mockery as a response to their own confusion. Lady, one of the investors, called out a man in his 40s with a wristwatch that caught the fluorescent light. Do you know what you're bidding on? That place is a condemned structure. It's 12 miles from civilization on a road that's closed half the year. You'll freeze to death before spring. You're buying a raccoon condo, someone else added to renewed laughter. Pierce held up one hand. His expression had shifted from theatrical to something more genuinely concerned. Ma'am, I'm legally required to make sure you understand the nature of this property. It is condemned. It is not habitable in its current condition. It has no utilities of any kind. The access road becomes impassable in winter, which is approximately 4 weeks from now. Are you certain you want to proceed with this bid? Eleanor looked at him directly. I'm certain. Pierce looked around the room. Anyone want to bid $6? More laughter, no bids. There was absolutely no reason for anyone in that room to pay $6 for a condemned structure with raccoons when they could spend that money on coffee on the way home. Going once at $5, Pierce said, and there was something in his voice now that might have been reluctant admiration. Going twice, he paused. The room was quiet. Sold. Property number 22 to the lady in the back. $5. The room applauded. It was not a kind applause. It was the applause of people watching something they considered a spectacle, the clapping of an audience rather than a community. Eleanor ignored it completely. She walked to the front of the room, opened her wallet, and placed 5 single-dollar bills on the table in front of Pierce. He looked at them for a moment. Then he pulled out the transfer documents and began filling in the blanks. Name, he asked. Eleanor Hayes. He filled out the paperwork, had her sign in 4 places. Then he slid a large manila envelope across the table containing the deed, a property survey from 1987, and a hand-drawn map showing the route to Timber Ridge Road. Congratulations, Mrs. Hayes, Pierce said. He said it quietly so the room would not hear. The address is 1847 Timber Ridge Road. Eleanor looked at the number on the envelope. 1847, the year Raymond's father had been born. The detail Raymond had mentioned exactly once at their wedding rehearsal dinner when his father was making a toast and had said, I was born in 1847. No, I'm joking, 1947, but the other number always felt like it meant something. Everyone had laughed. Eleanor had laughed. She had never thought about it again until this moment. She was not a superstitious woman. She had not been raised to look for signs. But she had spent the last 3 years sleeping on Raymond's side of the bed because it still smelled faintly of him, and she had worn his father's watch every day since he died. And she understood without being able to explain it rationally that 1847 Timber Ridge Road was exactly where she was supposed to go. She picked up the envelope, lifted her suitcase, balanced her boxes, and walked out of the county administration building while 30 real estate investors watched her go. Outside, the November air had not gotten warmer. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk, the envelope under her arm, the Samsonite at her feet, and looked at the hand-drawn map. Timber Ridge Road was 12 miles northeast of Burlington, accessible only via a logging road that branched off Route 117 and was not maintained by the county. She had $51.38 remaining. A taxi would cost at least $40 for a 12-mile trip. She needed every remaining dollar. She began walking. She walked the first 3 miles to the northern edge of Burlington, where the road widened and the houses grew farther apart, and the maples were stripped of their leaves and stood with the particular dignity of trees that have survived many winters. Her back ached. The Samsonite's broken handle twisted against the twine whenever the wheel caught a crack in the sidewalk. The cardboard boxes grew heavier with every mile in the way that weight always accumulates in direct proportion to exhaustion. At the edge of town, she found a small general store attached to a gas station, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. The sign above the door read, Coles Supply East, 1987. A man in his late 60s was locking the front door. As Eleanor arrived, a ring of keys in his hand, a canvas jacket with a fraying collar. He turned when he heard the Samsonite on the pavement and looked at Eleanor, the way that certain people look at things that require a decision fully and without flinching. His name was Harlan Cole. He was 68 years old. He had taught high school earth science in Burlington for 31 years, retiring in 2015, after which he had bought and managed 3 rental properties in the outlying towns and helped his younger brother run the family store on the days the brother needed coverage. He was not a man who talked much. His students had always said he was the kind of teacher who made you feel that whatever you were looking at, a rock formation, a weather pattern, a soil sample, was genuinely worth your full attention. You all right? He asked. I need to get to Timber Ridge Road, Eleanor said. I just purchased a property there. I don't have transportation. Harlan Cole looked at the Samsonite. He looked at the boxes. He looked at Eleanor's face with its fine lines and its absolute composure, and the faint redness around her eyes that she had not been entirely successful in erasing. "Timber Ridge," he said. "That's deep in. Nothing out there but old logging cuts and forest. I know the road." "I know," Eleanor said. "That's where I'm going." He was quiet for a moment. Then he put his keys in his jacket pocket. "Truck's around back." "I can't pay you," Eleanor said. Not apologetically, simply as a fact. "Didn't ask you to," Harlan Cole said, and walked toward the rear of the building. The drive took 40 minutes, most of it on progressively narrower and rougher roads. Harlan drove without speaking much, which Eleanor appreciated. She had used up her words for the day. She looked out the window at the Vermont forest in November, which is a particular kind of beauty, stripped and honest all structure, and no ornament, the trees showing exactly what they are without the softening of leaves. When they turned onto Timber Ridge Road, the road became two tire tracks through overgrown brush, small saplings growing in the center median where no vehicle had recently passed. Harlan slowed to a crawl. Branches scraped against the sides of the truck. After a quarter-mile, the tracks opened into a clearing. And there it was. Eleanor looked at the structure for a long time without speaking. In the last gray light of a November afternoon, it looked less like a house and more like something the forest had been slowly absorbing for decades, which was essentially correct. The roof sagged in the middle and had a hole on the right side 3 feet across open to the sky, and every window was broken. The front door hung on one hinge tilted into the frame at an angle that suggested it had not closed properly in years. Vines had pulled themselves up the eastern wall and through a gap near the eaves. The front porch had collapsed on the left side, the boards caved in, and rotting into the ground they had once stood above. The whole structure leaned slightly, as though it had been deciding for years which direction it would eventually fall. Harlan Cole let out a slow breath. He did not say anything for a moment. "That's what you bought," he said finally. "That's what I bought," Eleanor confirmed. He was quiet again. Then he opened his door. "Let me help you get your things inside. I have a tarp in the bed. We can cover that roof hole. Won't be much, but it'll keep the worst of the rain off tonight." They spent the next 45 minutes making the place minimally habitable. Harlan used a crowbar from his truck to force the swollen door open. They cleared a path through the debris inside: leaves, branches, animal leavings, broken glass, decades of accumulated neglect. Harlan got the tarp over the roof hole and secured it with rope tied to exposed beams. He came back from his truck with a battery-powered lantern, a water bottle, and a $20 bill. Eleanor tried to refuse the money. He shook his head, once the way men of his generation sometimes make a point without making a speech. "Listen," he said, standing in the doorway, his breath visible in the cold air. "There's a camp store about 5 miles back the way we came. Marge Tully runs it. She's practical and she's fair. Tell her I sent you." He paused. He seemed to be calculating something internally. "I come this way every week or so, checking on my properties. I'll stop by." Eleanor looked at him. "Mr. Cole." "Harlan." "Harlan, thank you. For the ride, for the tarp, for all of it." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not pity and was not admiration exactly, but was something between the two. The expression of someone who has just witnessed something they have not yet fully categorized. Then he nodded once, walked to his truck, and drove back down the two-track road into the dark. Eleanor stood in the clearing and watched the taillights disappear through the trees. Then she turned to face her house. Inside, she set the lantern down and looked at what she owned. The main room was perhaps 300 square feet. The floor was solid beneath the debris, she could tell that much. Even now, the wood dense and heavy under her feet, the kind of old-growth timber that does not rot quickly. The walls showed water damage and mold-black stains spreading from the corners like slow bruises. The ceiling was mostly intact except for the hole in the tarp. A wood stove sat against the north wall, rusted heavily but standing. A crude wooden table against one wall had survived improbably in reasonable condition. From the kitchen area, something moved. A pair of eyes caught the lantern light, the mother raccoon watching from the top of a cabinet, her 3 young visible behind her. She chittered once, irritated. "This is my house," Eleanor said aloud. Her voice sounded strange in the empty space too large for what it was coming from. She cleared a 6-by-6 section of floor. With a stick, swept it down to the boards, laid her coat as a ground cloth. From the suitcase, she took Robert's Raymond's watch and her mother's Bible and set them side by side near the lantern. She ate half a granola bar. She drank water from the bottle Harlan had left. Then she lay down on her coat, pulled the blanket over herself, and looked up at the water-stained ceiling. What Harlan Cole had not told her, what he would not tell her for nearly 2 years, was that he had not driven away when his taillights disappeared into the trees. He had driven to the end of the two-track road where it met the gravel of the county logging route, turned off his headlights, and sat in his truck with the engine idling for the warmth. He sat there for 3 hours. He watched the faint glow of the battery lantern through the broken window frame, visible through the trees as a small, steady light. He watched it move. Occasionally she was working, clearing, making decisions, and then settle in one place as the hour grew late. He sat there because he had driven away from things he shouldn't have before earlier in his life, and he had learned the specific cost of that. He was not going to drive away from a 70-year-old woman alone in a condemned structure on the first night of a Vermont November and find out the next morning that he had made a mistake he couldn't undo. When the lantern light went still and stayed still, he waited another 20 minutes. Then he put the truck in gear and drove home. Eleanor did not know this. She lay on the floor of her house with the raccoons settling in the kitchen and the wind moving through the pines outside and the cold coming in through the gaps in the walls, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt like herself, not the version of herself that had been managing since Raymond died, not the version that had been diminishing slowly as the property taxes climbed and the furnace groaned and the calls to Daniel about the gutters went unanswered. Not the version that had sat in her own living room and been told she was a burden by children she had spent 40 years building. She felt like the Eleanor who had learned to drive at 30 because Raymond worked long hours and she wasn't going to be stranded. The Eleanor who had retiled the bathroom herself one summer because the quote from the contractor was ridiculous. The Eleanor who had canned 40 jars of tomatoes every August for 2 decades because she liked the work and she liked knowing the shelf was full. She was still that woman. She had simply forgotten. Outside, the pines moved in the dark. The house creaked and settled. In the kitchen, the raccoon mother made a low sound, less irritated, now more resigned. Eleanor closed her eyes. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Part 2, the work. December in Vermont does not negotiate. It arrives with a particular authority of something that has been coming for a long time and sees no reason to apologize for its arrival. The temperature along Timber Ridge Road dropped to 19 degrees on the third night Eleanor slept in the house, and she lay under 2 blankets and her wool coat and Raymond's old cardigan. She had packed without entirely knowing why, and she listened to the cold finding its way through every gap in the walls, and she made a list in her head. Not a list of problems, a list of solutions. This was something Eleanor had learned in 40 years of managing a house, a marriage, 2 children, and the 1,000 small emergencies that constitute a life. The moment you start cataloging what's wrong, you've already lost half the battle. The useful question was never what's broken. It was always what can I do about it today with what I actually have. She had clay soil along the creek bank 200 yards down the slope behind the house. She had pine forest on 3 sides, which meant unlimited straight branches and boughs. She had a dull handsaw in the ruins of a collapsed shed she had found her second morning, its blade rusted, but its teeth still present. She had twine a hammer and 6 nails she had found in a rusted coffee can on the floor of the shed. She had her own 2 hands, which were soft from years of domestic work and would not stay soft for long. She started with the windows. There were 6 window openings in the main room and the small bedroom, each one a rectangle of broken glass in November air. Eleanor used the saw to cut straight branches from the younger birch trees at the edge of the clearing, then wove them into panels tight and overlapping, stuffing the gaps with dried grass she pulled from the field edge. She mixed creek clay with ash from the wood stove she had gotten burning on her 4th day, a process that required 2 hours of cleaning rust and debris from the flue, and produced a fire that smoked terribly before it found its draft, and she packed this mixture into the woven panels and let it dry. It took her 3 weeks to seal all 6 windows. They let in no light. They let in almost no wind. In the particular mathematics of survival, that was the correct trade. The roof was harder. She could not replace it. The materials alone would cost more than she had, but she could slow it down. She cut pine boughs by the armload, working in the mornings when the cold was still and the air had not yet begun to move, and she layered them across the damaged sections in overlapping rows like shingles, securing them with lengths of twine nailed to the exposed framing. The pine pitch sealed the gaps naturally as the boughs settled. When it rained the first time, a cold, driving rain on a Saturday in late November, Eleanor stood inside and watched the ceiling with her lantern held high. 3 small leaks. She marked each one with a piece of charcoal from the stove. Patched them the next morning before dawn. 3 days a week, she woke at 3:30 in the morning and walked 5 miles through the dark forest to Marge Tully's camp store, following the beam of Harlan's lantern on the logging road, which she had memorized by her second week well enough to walk it in near darkness. She arrived at 5 and worked until 8, sweeping stocking shelves, cleaning the glass on the display cases, hauling trash to the dumpster out back. Marge paid her $15 an hour in cash, folded in a plain envelope left on the counter at the end of each shift. Marge Tully was 63 and had run the store for 22 years, first with her husband and then after he left alone. She was not a woman who expressed sympathy easily, but she expressed it in the way that mattered in work, given in fair pay, in the occasional paper bag left by the register, with day-old bread and surplus produce that couldn't be sold but still had use. She never explained these bags. Eleanor never asked her to. On Eleanor's third week, Marge said, "You're the talk of the county, you know. Woman who bought the Timber Ridge place for $5. People think you're either crazy or dead." "I'm neither," Eleanor said, wiping down the counter. "I can see that," Marge said. And that was the end of it. Harlan Cole came by every week, usually on a Wednesday, usually in the late morning. He drove his truck down the 2-track road and arrived carrying something he invariably described as something he had no further use for: a kerosene lantern with a full reservoir, a wool blanket good quality barely used, a short-handled axe in a leather sheath, a box of waterproof matches, a hand drill with a set of bits. Eleanor accepted each item the way it was offered, without ceremony, without excessive gratitude. She said thank you once clearly, and then she put the thing to use. This arrangement seemed to suit them both. He would stay for an hour, sometimes 2. He did not give advice unless she asked for it. He would look at what she had done since his last visit: the sealed window, the patched roof section, the floorboards she had leveled by chiseling down the high edges, and he would nod once in a way that meant he had assessed it and found it sound. Then he would take out whatever he had brought, and they would work on something together, mostly in silence, the way 2 people who understand the same language sometimes don't need to speak it. Once in early December, he stood in the doorway looking at the clay-sealed windows and the pine bough roof patches and the leveled floor, and said without turning around, "People in town say you'll be dead before Christmas." "They'll be disappointed," Eleanor said. Harlan made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. Then he picked up the hand drill and went to work on the door frame, which was torqued badly enough that the door still would not close properly. Eleanor had begun to understand the house in the way you begin to understand anything you live with closely, not as a collection of problems, but as a personality. The structure had been built by someone who knew what they were doing. The framing was mortise and tenon the old way, which meant no nails to pull loose and no modern fasteners to corrode. The floorboards were white oak, 3 inches thick, laid tight. The foundation was fieldstone dry stacked, which meant no mortar to crack, but also meant it had settled over a century and a half into a stability that modern concrete footings sometimes never achieve. Beneath the neglect and the damage and the smell of rot and animal and time, the house had bones. Good bones, Raymond would have said, and he would have meant it the way he meant most things, simply and accurately. On a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of December, Eleanor was working on the ceiling. She had noticed several days earlier that one section of ceiling boards near the center of the main room was different from the others. The water damage that had spread across most of the ceiling, brown and black stained soft spots where moisture had soaked through from the damaged roof, stopped at a particular beam and did not continue into a roughly 4-foot section of boards beyond it. This was not how water damage worked. Water did not stop at a beam. It followed gravity, and gravity did not respect framing members. Eleanor stood on the wooden crate she used as a step stool and pressed her palm against the boards in the undamaged section. They were dry, not just dry or dry, completely dry, with the particular solidity of wood that has been protected from moisture rather than wood that has simply not yet been reached by it. She used the claw end of her hammer to pry up the edge of one board. It came loose with the groan of old cut nails pulling from old timber, and Eleanor lifted it aside and raised her lantern into the gap. There was a space above the ceiling boards, perhaps 18 inches deep, between the ceiling and the roof framing. This was common in old construction, a dead air space for insulation, a gap that had been standard practice in cold climate building for most of the 19th century. In this space, resting on the ceiling, joist was a wooden crate. It was perhaps 2 feet square and 18 inches deep. What had once been an oilcloth wrapping was draped over it, partially disintegrated, the cloth having done most of its and then surrendered to time. The crate itself was in better condition than anything else in the house. The wood was dense black walnut. Eleanor would learn later, a wood that resists moisture and insects both, and it had survived where lesser materials had not. Burned into the side of the crate with a branding iron in letters 1.5 inches tall was EV 1874. Eleanor stood on her crate and looked at those letters for a long time. She climbed down and pulled the step crate directly under the opening. She reached up and worked the crate to the edge of the joist, slowly, carefully testing the weight. It was heavier than she expected. She lowered it by degrees, taking the weight with her arms and then her legs until it was resting on the floor in front of her. She sat down cross-legged on the floor beside it. The crate was sealed with a simple wooden latch, a pivoting bar of wood on a hand-cut screw. Eleanor turned the latch and lifted the lid. The smell that came out was old and dry and faintly aromatic, the smell of old paper and dried plant matter, and the particular chemical neutrality of things that have been sealed away from the world for a long time. Inside, wrapped in additional layers of oilcloth that had fared better than the outer covering, were 6 leather-bound journals of varying thickness, and packed carefully between them, dozens of sheets of thick paper holding pressed and dried botanical specimens. Eleanor lifted the top journal. The leather was dry and cracked, but intact. She opened it to the first page with the deliberate care of someone handling something that deserves to be handled carefully. The handwriting was small and precise, the letters formed with the particular discipline of someone who had been educated in an era when penmanship was understood as a moral quality. Edmund Voss, it read, Field Naturalist, New England Survey, Flora and Pharmacology, commenced June 1871. Eleanor turned a few pages. The entries were dated and detailed. June 14th, 1871, arrived at the property on Timber Ridge. The structure is complete enough for habitation. The forest here is exceptional species density and diversity beyond anything I have encountered in 4 years of work in this country. I have reason to believe that several of the specimens I have already identified in the surrounding area have not been formally documented. The work will proceed well here. She turned to a later entry. October 3rd, 1873. My health is not good. The winters take more from me each year, but the work is more important than the man doing it, and I am not yet finished. I have written to my brother in London. He has written back to say the family no longer considers me rational, that my decision to remain here rather than return to manage father's estate was the act of a man who had abandoned his responsibilities. He is not wrong that I abandoned my responsibilities. He is entirely wrong about what my responsibilities are. Eleanor turned to the final journal. The last entry was dated March 9th, 1874. I am putting everything away now. The journals, the specimens, the drawings. I am sealing them in the walnut crate I built for this purpose and concealing them above the ceiling where they should remain protected until someone finds them who understands what they are. My family believes I am dead. I became ill in January, and the word reached Burlington and then reached England that Edmund Voss had died of fever in his cottage in the northern woods of Vermont. I did not correct this impression. It seemed to me that a dead man's work would be left alone, which is all I have ever asked. I do not know who will find this. I hope they will be someone who understands that some things belong to the land that produced them and not to the people who discovered them. I have tried to act accordingly. The work is done. This house remembers everything I put into it. I hope it remembers me as someone who was worth the keeping. Eleanor sat on the floor of the house for a very long time after reading that. Outside, the December wind moved through the pines. The wood stove ticked with the sound of contracting metal as the afternoon fire burned down to coals. The forest was absolutely still in the particular way that forests are still when the temperature drops fast, and every living thing goes quiet to conserve what warmth it has. Edmund Voss had been 73 years old when he disappeared. He had built this house with his own hands. He had been told by the people closest to him that his choices were the choices of a man who had abandoned what mattered. He had put his life's work in a box and hidden it above the ceiling of a house that would eventually fall to pieces around the secret he had left inside it. And then he had walked out into the Vermont winter and been, as far as the world was concerned, simply gone. Eleanor Hayes, who was 70 years old and had arrived at this house 6 weeks ago with a cardboard suitcase and a $5 deed, sat on the floor and understood something she could not have articulated precisely but felt with absolute clarity. She was not the first person who had come to this house with nothing. She was not the first person who had been told they were finished. She was not the first person who had decided otherwise. She began going through the specimens the following morning. She worked slowly and carefully, spreading the pressed plants on the wooden table and examining them under the strongest light the lantern could provide. Each specimen was mounted on a sheet of heavy paper and labeled in the same small, precise handwriting as the journals. Latin names, collection dates, location notes, observations about habit and habitat. The work was meticulous. The preservation was extraordinary. In the sealed, dry environment of the walnut crate above the ceiling, 145 years had passed over these specimens without reaching them. Most of the plants she did not recognize. This was not surprising. She was not a botanist. But in the sixth journal, in a section Voss had titled Specimens of Particular Note, she found something that stopped her. He had numbered 23 plants as particularly significant, providing detailed notes for each observed properties, extraction methods, documented effects on minor ailments. He had treated himself with preparations made from each plant. His notes were careful to avoid absolute claims phrased always as observed correlation rather than established fact. He was a scientist. He was also a man of his time, alone in the woods with a sore knee and a persistent cough, and some of the things he documented were the results of straightforward self-experimentation. 22 of the 23 had Latin designations and full documentation. The 23rd had a star drawn beside its entry in ink, a small, five-pointed star, the same on every page. It appeared pressed firmly into the paper, as though the pen had paused on it with intention. There was a pressed specimen mounted beside the entry intact. There were drawings of the plant in 3 stages of growth. There were detailed chemical observations about the oil content of the leaves, observations that in 1874 would have required either exceptional equipment or exceptional intuition. But there was no Latin name, no formal designation, just the star. And at the bottom of the entry, a single line in a slightly different ink, as though written at a different time. This one I will not name. What is named can be claimed. What is claimed will be sold. Let it remain unnamed. Eleanor read this line 3 times. Then she went to find Harlan Cole. She walked to his rental property 3 miles down the logging road, which she knew he visited on Thursdays. She arrived to find him on the porch, replacing a section of railing, a skill saw at his feet, measuring tape hanging from his belt. She showed him the crate, not immediately. She explained first the ceiling board, the dry section, the latch, what she had found inside. Harlan listened without speaking, in the way he did everything completely and without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Edmund Voss, he said. You've heard of him. I taught natural history for 31 years, Harlan said. Edmund Voss was significant. British naturalist, came to America in 1869. His early work on plant pharmacology was considered foundational. He disappeared from Vermont in 1874, and his body was never found. The academic consensus was that he died alone in the woods, and the work he'd been doing for the last 3 years of his life went with him. He paused. You're telling me it didn't? I'm telling you it's in a walnut crate on my kitchen table. Harlan was quiet again for longer this time. Then he stood up and put the measuring tape in his jacket pocket. Show me, he said. He spent 2 hours with the journals and the specimens, handling them with the careful reverence of a man who understood what he was holding. He photographed every page with his phone, moving slowly and methodically, making sure the light was adequate. He did not say much during this process. When he was done, he set the final journal down carefully and looked across the table at Eleanor. I want to send these photographs to someone, he said. A professor I know at the University of Vermont, Dr. Lorraine Hadley. She specializes in historical botanical studies. She's going to tell me I'm either pulling her leg or I've found the most significant botanical historical discovery in decades. Do it, Eleanor said. And Eleanor. He said her first name with the particular weight of a man who doesn't use first names carelessly. Whatever this is worth historically, scientifically, whatever it belongs to you. You own this property. You found this. I want you to understand that before anyone else gets involved. Eleanor looked at him across the table. I understand it, she said. Make the call. Dr. Lorraine Hadley's response arrived 4 days later. Harlan showed Eleanor the email on his phone standing in the kitchen of the house, the walnut crate on the table between them. The email was long and technically detailed in its middle sections, but its opening was clear enough. If this is a fabrication, it is the most technically sophisticated fabrication I have encountered in 20 years of academic work. I do not believe it is a fabrication. The handwriting is consistent with authenticated samples of Voss's correspondence held at the Smithsonian. The Latin taxonomy is accurate to 1870s classification standards, including several designations that were revised in the 1890s and would require specialist knowledge to replicate. Several of the species described were known interests of Voss based on his published work. Before his disappearance, I need to see these materials in person. When can I come? Eleanor handed the phone back to Harlan. She comes here, Eleanor said. I'm not sending these anywhere. Understood, Harlan said. I'll tell her. Dr. Hadley arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of January, driving a gray Subaru that she parked in the cleared space outside the cottage with the careful precision of someone who was not accustomed to arriving at places with no pavement. She was 54 with the compact, efficient energy of someone who had spent decades working in conditions that didn't accommodate impatience. She was skeptical. Eleanor could see this clearly in the way she greeted them, professionally warm, in a way that contained its own reservation, the posture of a scientist who has been excited before and has learned to keep excitement at a controlled distance until the evidence earns it. That lasted approximately 8 minutes. Eleanor watched Dr. Hadley's face as she opened the first journal and read the opening pages. Watch the professional reserve shift. Watch something genuine take its place, not excitement exactly. Something larger and slower than excitement. The expression of someone who has spent their career looking for something and has just seen it for the first time. She worked through the afternoon without stopping, examining the specimens under the magnifying glass. She had brought cross-referencing the journal entries against reference materials on her laptop. Eleanor made coffee on the camp stove and left a cup near her and let her work. At 4:30, Dr. Hadley sat back in her chair and looked at Eleanor. This is real, she said. Everything I can check is consistent. The specimens are authentic. The journals are authentic. The handwriting is authentic. Edmund Voss built this house, lived here for 3 years, conducted what appears to be the most extensive, systematic survey of northern Vermont flora ever undertaken in the 19th century, and hid his life's work in the ceiling before walking out into the woods for the last time. She paused. Mrs. Hayes, do you understand what you've found? I'm beginning to, Eleanor said. Dr. Hadley spent another hour going through the 6th journal, the one with the starred specimens. When she reached the entry for the unnamed plant, she stopped. She read it twice. She looked at the specimen mounted beside it. She read the chemical observations in the entry with increasing attention, leaning closer to the page. Then she sat up and looked at Eleanor with an expression that had something careful in it, something measured. This compound he's describing, she said, indicating the entry for the starred plant. The oil extraction observations, the structural notes, these are, she stopped, started again. In 2003, a pharmaceutical research team in Boston isolated a compound from a related plant family that became the basis for a broad-spectrum antibacterial agent. The structural characteristics of that compound, or what Voss is describing here, is functionally identical. She set the journal down. He found it in 1873. He found it 130 years before we did alone in a Vermont forest with a hand lens and a camp stove. The room was quiet. The specimen is intact, Dr. Hadley continued, which means viable material for analysis, which means Mrs. Hayes, the research value alone is... Dr. Hadley, Eleanor said. Something in her voice made the professor stop. Read the last line of that entry, Eleanor said. Dr. Hadley looked down at the journal. Reed looked up. He said not to name it, Eleanor said. He said, "What is named is claimed. What is claimed is sold." Mrs. Hayes, the scientific— "I'm not a scientist," Eleanor said, "but I can read. And the man who built this house and hid his life's work in the ceiling and walked away from everything to do the work he believed in, he left one instruction. One." She nodded toward the journal. "Right there." Dr. Hadley was quiet for a moment. "There will be interest," she said carefully. "When this becomes known, there will be very significant commercial interest in those specimens. Pharmaceutical interest." "I expect so," Eleanor said. "They will offer substantial money." "I expect that too." "And you're telling me you intend to decline?" Eleanor looked at the walnut crate on the table, at the journals that had been waiting above a ceiling for 145 years, at the pressed specimen of the unnamed plant intact and legible, and carrying within its dried tissues something that a man in 1873 had understood was worth protecting. "Edmund Voss chose this land over his family's money," she said. "He chose the work over the reward. He built this house and lived in it alone for 3 winters and died or disappeared, whatever the truth is, without ever telling anyone what he had." She looked at Dr. Hadley directly. "The least I can do is honor one instruction." Dr. Hadley studied her for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression, the last of the professional reserve finally and completely replaced by something unguarded and genuine. "All right," she said. "Then here's what we do instead." 3 weeks later, a courier arrived from a pharmaceutical company headquartered in Boston. He carried a letter on company letterhead offering Eleanor Hayes $2,400,000 for the rights to the botanical specimens and any associated materials found at 1847 Timber Ridge Road. Eleanor read the letter once. She folded it carefully along its original creases, put it back in its envelope, and wrote 2 words on the outside in the same pencil she used for everything. "No, thank you." She left the envelope on the table, and in the morning she drove back to work at Marge's store at 5 in the morning, the way she always did, and the letter sat there until Harlan picked it up on his Wednesday visit, read the 2 words on the outside, and set it back down without comment. "You're sure," he said. "Voss was sure," Eleanor said. "That's enough for me." Harlan nodded once. Then he picked up his tools and went to work on the south wall, where the chinking between the logs had been deteriorating since before Eleanor arrived, and they worked together in the cold morning light until it was done. Part 3. The reckoning spring comes late to the northern Vermont woods. By the time the snow retreats from Timber Ridge Road, it is usually mid-April, and even then it retreats grudgingly, holding its ground in the shadows under the north-facing pines and in the low spots along the creek where the sun doesn't reach until nearly noon. The forest does not ease into spring the way warmer places do. It simply decides one morning that winter is finished, and then everything happens at once: the mud, the meltwater, the sudden aggressive green of things that have been waiting underground for 5 months with considerable impatience. Eleanor noticed the change on the 14th of April, 2020. She was outside splitting kindling when the light shifted not in quality but in angle, the sun reaching the clearing at a steepness that said something fundamental had turned. The mud under her boots had the smell of soil coming back to itself. The creek, audible from the house, now that the snow was gone from the banks, ran loud and clear over the rocks at the bottom of the slope. She had survived the winter. Not just survived it, she had worked through it day by day, solving the problems it set in front of her with the resources she had and the determination she had discovered she possessed in quantities she had not previously known. The clay-sealed windows held. The pine bough roof patches held. The wood stove cleaned and adjusted and learned heated the main room to 60 degrees when properly fed, which was warm enough. She had not gone hungry. She had not gone without water. She had not, despite the predictions of 30 real estate investors, and most of Burlington died. The house looked different in April than it had in November. Not restored, that would come later. But purposeful, functional. The cleared grounds, the stacked firewood, the vegetable bed Eleanor had turned and prepared against the south-facing wall where the sun hit longest. The smoke coming from the chimney each morning. The signs of a place being lived in and cared for, which are the signs that matter most to a house. Dr. Lorraine Hadley had been working steadily through the winter, building the case for historical designation with the University of Vermont's History Department and the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation. The process was not fast. Government processes of this kind are not designed for speed. They are designed for thoroughness, which serves a different purpose and operates on a different timeline. There were site surveys, archival cross-references, consultations with botanical historians, a review of the Smithsonian's Voss correspondence files that required 3 weeks of communication between Burlington and Washington. But in the second week of September 2020, Eleanor received a letter by certified mail from the Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development. She read it standing at the kitchen table in the morning light, still in her work clothes from the early shift at Marge's store. 1847 Timber Ridge Road, Burlington, Vermont was hereby designated a Vermont State Historic Site, effective immediately under the authority of the Vermont Historic Sites and Structures Survey. The designation recognized the property as the documented final residence and primary research site of Edmund Voss, British field naturalist, whose recovered journals and botanical specimens represented a discovery of significant historical and scientific importance. The designation carried with it protections against demolition or unsanctioned alteration and made the property eligible for restoration funding through the Vermont Historic Preservation Trust. Attached to the letter was a separate document from the University of Vermont, signed by the Dean of Sciences, offering Eleanor Hayes the position of site caretaker and resident curator, effective upon completion of restoration work, with a monthly stipend of $1,100. Eleanor set the letter down on the table. She sat down in the chair beside it. She had been sitting in that chair for 7 months, eating her meals there, reading there by lantern light, planning her days from that spot, with the practical efficiency of someone who understands that the distance between where you are and where you need to be is crossed only one day at a time. She sat there for a while and did not do anything. Sometimes the right response to a piece of good news is to let it be what it is without immediately converting it into the next problem to solve. Then she put on her coat and walked 3 miles down the logging road to Tell Harlan Coal. Restoration work began in the spring of 2021. A team from the Vermont Historic Preservation Trust arrived in May with architects, craftspeople, and a project manager named Beverly Strand, who wore waterproof boots and spoke in the precise, unhurried cadences of someone who had overseen the restoration of 14 historic structures and had learned that the work went better when no one panicked. The parameters were strict, as they always were, with historic designation. Materials had to be period appropriate or structurally sympathetic to the original construction. Modern systems could be installed only if they could be concealed without compromising historic fabric. The goal was not to make the building look new. The goal was to make it look like what it actually was, a mid-19th century Vermont woodland cottage that had been properly cared for. Eleanor was present for every day of the work. She had opinions and she expressed them clearly, and Beverly Strand respected them in the way that experienced professionals respect the opinions of people who have demonstrably earned the right to have them. When the question arose of whether to replaster the interior walls or restore the original log chinking, Eleanor said restore the chinking. When the question arose of whether to replace the wood stove with a modern replica or source an authentic period stove, Eleanor said authentic period stove. When Beverly suggested that Eleanor's clay-sealed windows, the ones she had made herself in November of 2019 from woven branches and creek mud, might be removed and replaced with reproductions, Eleanor said no. They stay, she said, behind the new glazing, framed and lit. Beverly looked at the clay panels. She looked at Eleanor. As artifacts, she asked. As evidence, Eleanor said, that the house was lived in by someone who did what needed doing with what she had. Beverly Strand nodded once and wrote something in her notebook. The restoration took until the end of June. The roof was replaced with hand-split white cedar shingles, the kind that had been standard in Vermont construction in the 1870s. The foundation was pointed and reinforced without being altered. The floors were cleaned and refinished without being sanded down. Beverly's team worked carefully to preserve the tool marks in the old oak boards, the evidence of how they had been shaped. The walls, freed of mold and carefully stabilized, showed the grain of the original timber in a way that no amount of paint or plaster would have improved. Modern plumbing and electrical were run through the structure with the care of surgeons, hidden in chases cut into the least historically significant portions of the framing, invisible from any angle that mattered. A composting system was installed behind the house. A small propane line was run for the kitchen stove, its fitting concealed behind a period-appropriate cabinet. In the bedroom, a climate-controlled case of museum-grade glass was installed along the north wall, Its environmental systems run off a dedicated electrical circuit. The Voss journals and specimens were moved into it in the first week of July, arranged chronologically, each item mounted on acid-free board lit from above with low UV lighting. The walnut crate that had held them for 145 years stood open beside the case, its burned initials visible to anyone who came to look. Eleanor moved her own belongings into the restored house on a Saturday morning in late July. She did not have many belongings. The winter had reduced her possessions to what was essential, and she had discovered, in the way that people sometimes discover things only when they have no choice, that essential was enough. More than enough. The bedroom held a proper bed, a wooden desk, a shelf of books. The main room had 2 chairs, a reading lamp, the wood stove, the kitchen area, and the work table where she spent her mornings reviewing research materials and preparing for the visitors who came to see the Voss collection. She hung Raymond's Bulova watch on a nail beside the bedroom door, where she could see it first thing each morning. On the morning of November 15th, 2020, exactly 1 year after Eleanor had been left on a Burlington sidewalk with a broken suitcase and $56, she was in the garden when she heard the sound of a vehicle on the 2-track road. She straightened and looked toward the sound. The SUV that came into the clearing was a late-model Audi Silver Clean, in the particular way of cars that are regularly detailed, rather than regularly used for anything that might dirty them. It parked in the small gravel area that had been cleared as a visitor lot, and 2 people got out. Eleanor had not seen her children in 1 year. Daniel looked older than she remembered, though she knew this was probably a function of the year she had lived and what it had done to her sense of time rather than anything that had actually happened to him. He wore a quilted vest and dark jeans and the expression of a man who had rehearsed something and was preparing to deliver it. Claire stood slightly behind him, her arms crossed loosely against the November chill, her eyes moving across the restored cottage and the cleared grounds and the historical marker, with an expression that Eleanor could not immediately read. Eleanor set down her garden fork. She did not walk toward them. She stood at the edge of the vegetable bed which she had been turning under for winter, and she waited. She had learned in the past year the particular power of stillness. She had learned it from the house which had been standing in this clearing for 150 years and had outlasted every opinion anyone had ever had about it. Daniel and Claire crossed the clearing toward her. "Mom," Daniel said. "Daniel," Eleanor said. "Claire." There was a pause in which several things that were not said passed between them, with the particular weight of things that have been a long time coming. "We've been looking for you," Daniel said. "For months." "I've been here," Eleanor said. "I've been here since the day you left me on a sidewalk." Claire's arms tightened across her chest. She looked at the ground briefly. "We heard about this place. The discovery. It's been in the news." "It has," Eleanor agreed. You've done something remarkable here," Daniel said, and Eleanor could hear in his voice the tone of a man who has come with a purpose and is finding the approach more difficult than he anticipated. "The historical designation, the university involvement. This property must be worth considerably more than you paid for it." There it was. Eleanor had known it was coming. She had known it from the moment she heard the SUV on the road. Not because she thought badly of her children, but because she had learned in the past year to see clearly, which is one of the things that surviving a very hard thing tends to give you, whether you want it or not. "It is," she said simply. "Mama," Claire said, and there was something in her voice now that was genuine, something that broke through the rehearsed surface. "We made a terrible mistake. What we did, the way we handled things last year, we've thought about it a great deal, and we know it was wrong." Eleanor looked at her daughter. She looked at her for a long time the way she had once looked at the clay-sealed windows and the pine bough roof patches, not with love or its absence, but with clear-eyed accuracy. "I believe that you've thought about it," Eleanor said. "I believe something changed when you heard the news." Daniel started to speak. Eleanor raised one hand, not sharply, just firmly, the way you raise a hand when you need the space to finish a thought. "I want to tell you something," she said, "because you're my children, and I spent 40 years making sure you knew what I thought mattered, and this matters." She looked at the cottage, at the cedar shingled roof and the restored stone foundation and the historical marker by the path, and the small cleared garden, and the 2 chairs visible through the window, placed close to the wood stove. "On the morning you drove away from that house," she said, "I had $56 in a suitcase with a broken handle. I walked 3 miles in November to find a ride to an auction where 30 people laughed at me. I spent the first night in a building with no windows, no heat, no water, and a family of raccoons in the kitchen. I sealed those windows with creek mud and birch branches, and I patched that roof with pine boughs. And I woke up at 3:30 in the morning, 3 days a week, to walk 5 miles through the dark to clean a camp store for $15 an hour. She paused. I did all of that alone, not because I wanted to do it alone, because you gave me no choice. Neither Daniel nor Claire spoke. And then I found what was in the ceiling, Eleanor continued, and I made decisions about what to do with it, decisions that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with what the man who built this house had believed was worth protecting. And those decisions turned out to be the right ones. She looked at them both directly. Not because they made me wealthy, because they were right, because there are things worth protecting that can't be sold. And I had spent 60 years in the company of a man who understood that. And it turned out I understood it too. She stopped. The November air moved through the clearing. A woodpecker worked somewhere in the upper canopy, the sound carrying clearly in the cold. You're not here because you missed me, Eleanor said. You may believe that you are. But what changed between last November and this November is not that you felt the weight of what you did. What changed is that you read a news article. I know the difference. Daniel's jaw tightened. Claire's eyes had gone bright. I'm not turning this property over to you, Eleanor said. It isn't mine to turn over. It belongs to Edmund Voss's memory and to the state of Vermont and to the researchers who come here to continue work that a man in the 1870s was willing to give his life to. I am its caretaker. That's what I am now. That's who I am. She gestured at the cottage. My will, such as it is, leaves this property to the Vermont Historical Society with conditions attached. There is nothing here for you to inherit or claim. Claire made a sound that was not quite words. It was at that moment that the door of the cottage opened and Harlan Cole came out. He had been inside doing maintenance on the climate control system for the Voss case, which required occasional calibration and which he had taken on as his particular responsibility without anyone asking him to. He stood on the porch with his tools in his hand and looked at the three people in the clearing with the untroubled calm of a man who has walked into complicated situations before and does not find them alarming. He looked at Daniel, he looked at Claire. He looked at them the way he had once looked at soil samples in a classroom, with complete attention and without any particular judgment, just assessment. These your kids? He asked Eleanor. They are, Eleanor said. Harlan nodded. He set his tools down on the porch railing and put his hands in his jacket pockets. I need to tell you both something, he said. He was not addressing them with hostility. He was addressing them the way he had addressed 30 years of students, directly, without ornamentation, because he believed that people deserved to be spoken to clearly. On the night your mother moved into this house, I drove her out here and dropped her off and drove away. And then I sat in my truck at the end of the road for 3 hours. Daniel looked at him. What 3 hours? Harlan said. In the dark, in November, because I wasn't going to leave a 70-year-old woman alone in a condemned building on the first night and find out in the morning that I'd made a mistake I couldn't fix. He looked at them steadily. I sat there and I watched the light in that window move around while she cleared the floor and got a fire going and settled in. I watched it until it went still, and then I went home. A silence settled over the clearing. I'm telling you this, Harlan continued, because there's a lawyer in Burlington who filed papers 3 weeks ago suggesting that your mother wasn't of sound mind when she made that bid, that she was confused, disoriented, possibly incompetent. His voice was entirely level. I was there. I watched her work for 3 hours in a ruined building alone at night. She wasn't confused. She wasn't disoriented. She was the most purposeful person I have seen in my 68 years. He picked up his tools from the railing. The papers were filed by someone. I imagine you know who. I imagine the attorney has already been in touch to let you know it isn't going anywhere. Daniel's face had gone through several changes during the speech. What settled there at the end was not anger. It was something more complicated, the expression of a man who has been clearly and accurately seen by someone he cannot dismiss or argue with, and who has not yet decided what to do with that. He looked at Eleanor. The attorney was my idea, he said. Claire didn't know. I know, Eleanor said. She looked at her daughter. I know. Claire was crying, not loudly. Quietly the way people cry when they are not trying to make a point but simply cannot stop what is happening. Eleanor felt something move in her chest, not forgiveness exactly. Something that preceded forgiveness, the recognition that the people standing in front of her were not villains. They were her children, flawed and short-sighted, incapable of the particular cruelty that only people who have been loved completely can visit on the person who loved them, because it requires that kind of safety to behave that badly. She did not go to Claire, but she spoke more gently. If you want to build something from this, she said, it has to start from the truth of what happened, not from what you can claim or what you can inherit or what you can get a lawyer to argue. The truth. She looked at both of them. When you're ready for that conversation, I will have it. Until then, I think you should go. They went. Daniel walked back to the Audi without speaking. Claire paused at the edge of the clearing and looked back at Eleanor. Once a look that contained more than Eleanor could fully read, and then she got in the car and they drove back down the two-track road and the sound of the engine faded into the forest. Harlan came down from the porch and stood beside Eleanor, watching the road. They stood there together for a moment without speaking. The lawyer's papers, Eleanor said. Is it actually handled? Called in a favor with a retired judge I know, Harlan said. Didn't even need to go to court. The judge reviewed the filing, looked at the auction records, looked at the deed transfer, and wrote a one-paragraph response that I believe was the most efficient dismissal I have ever seen. He paused. You were the high bidder at a public auction. The deed is clean. The property is yours unambiguously and entirely. Eleanor nodded. She looked at the cottage, at the cedar shingles and the stone foundation, and the clay panel windows preserved behind new glass, and the historical marker standing in the thin November light. I want to show you something, she said. She led him inside. On the work table near the Voss case was an envelope she had received 2 weeks earlier from the University of Vermont. She had not opened it with anyone present, which had not been a deliberate choice, but had turned out to feel appropriate. Harlan picked it up and read the letter inside with the same quiet attention he brought to everything. The letter was from Dr. Hadley, countersigned by the Dean of Sciences. It explained that the state of Vermont, acting through the university, had negotiated an agreement with a consortium of 3 pharmaceutical research institutions to conduct a 5-year study of the Voss botanical collection, specifically the starred specimens and the chemical observations in the 6th journal. The agreement was structured as a research license, not a sale. The specimens remained Eleanor's. The journals remained Eleanor's. The property remained Eleanor's. Under the terms of the agreement and under a historic preservation statute that Eleanor had not known existed until Dr. Hadley's team found it, Eleanor Hayes was entitled to a 5% royalty on any commercially viable findings resulting from research conducted on materials discovered on her property. The projected royalty, based on preliminary valuations by the research consortium, was estimated at $180,000 annually. She had refused $2,400,000. The work she had protected had in the end protected her. Harlan read the letter twice. Then he set it down carefully on the table the way he had set down the Voss journals the first time he held them, with the reverence that certain objects earn by being exactly what they are. Lorraine Hadley did this, he asked. Lorraine Hadley found the statute, Eleanor said. The research institutions made the offer because the work was worth making an offer for. Edmund Voss did the work. She looked at the climate-controlled case, at the journals standing in their orderly row behind the glass. I just didn't sell it. Harlan looked at her. He had the expression he sometimes had when he had finished assessing something, the expression that came after the non-rare and quieter. He would have liked you, he said. Voss? I think we would have understood each other, Eleanor said. People who build things alone usually do. On the 15th of November, 2021, 2 years to the day after Eleanor Hayes had stood on a Burlington sidewalk with $56 in a broken suitcase, she turned 72 years old. Harlan Cole came with a new splitting maul because he said the handle on her current one was getting loose, and he wanted her to deal with it before winter rather than after, and he left it on the porch with a card that said, "Happy Birthday, Eleanor," in handwriting that had the careful precision of a man who had spent 30 years writing on blackboards. Marge Tully came with a pie apple from the orchard 3 miles from her store, the last of the season's fruit, and stayed for 2 hours talking with the comfortable ease of people who have worked alongside each other long enough that silence is not uncomfortable and conversation is not obligatory. Dr. Lorraine Hadley drove up from Burlington with a package under her arm. She was not someone who typically gave physical gifts, which made the gesture mean more. Eleanor opened it at the kitchen table while Harlan and Marge watched. It was a bound copy of the academic paper that had been published in a botanical history journal the previous month, the recovered Voss collection Field Naturalism, Pharmacological Discovery, and the Limits of Classification in 19th Century New England. The authors were listed on the cover page in the order of their contribution. The first name was Eleanor Hayes, discoverer and primary conservator. The second name was Dr. Lorraine Hadley. Eleanor looked at the cover for a long time. Then she set it carefully on the table and looked at Dr. Hadley. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "The paper would not exist without you," Dr. Hadley said. "Neither would the collection. Neither would the findings. I have spent my career studying work that other people discovered. This time I was present for the discovery." She sat down across the table from Eleanor. "Your name goes first. That's not generosity. That's accuracy." Several other people had come, two researchers from UVM who had spent months working with the Voss journals, a graduate student named Petra who had been studying the star specimen entry and who had the intensity of someone at the beginning of a long and serious career, a couple from the neighboring county who had read about the cottage in the local paper and driven out to visit and somehow become regulars over the months that followed. They ate, they talked. The wood stove burned steadily in the corner. Outside, the November dark settled over the clearing and the pines and the two-track road that wound back through the forest toward the county route, and the light from the cottage windows lay warm and distinct on the ground. After the others had left, Eleanor and Harlan sat on the porch in their coats, with cups of coffee looking at the tree line. The stars were out. Stars were clear. Nights in November in northern Vermont are cold with the particular intensity of cold that comes with clarity. No clouds, no buffer, just the dark and the cold, and the stars with their indifferent precision. 2 years, Harlan said. 2 years, Eleanor agreed. They were quiet for a while. "Do you think about them?" he asked. He did not specify who he meant. He did not need to. Eleanor thought about it honestly. "I think about Claire sometimes," she said. "I think she is genuinely sorry. I think she doesn't entirely know what to do with that yet. And I think that's her work to do, not mine." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I spent 40 years doing other people's work for them. I'm done with that." Harlan nodded. "And Daniel?" he asked. "Daniel will do what makes sense to Daniel," she said. "He always has. I raised a capable man. What he does with that capacity is his business." Another silence, comfortable and unhurried. "What Voss wrote," Eleanor said. "In that last entry, he said he hoped whoever found the work would be someone who understood it." "You understood it," Harlan said. "I understood one part of it," Eleanor said. "The part about the land remembering." She looked at the cottage, at the shape of it against the dark, the chimney smoke rising straight in the still air, the historical marker catching faint starlight at the edge of the path. "This house has been standing since 1871. It's been through 15 Vermont winters alone. It's been through neglect and abandonment and a county inspector who wanted to demolish it. It stood through all of that." She set down her coffee cup on the porch railing. "I like to think it was waiting," she said, "not for anyone specific, just patient, knowing that what was inside it was worth the waiting." Harlan looked at her for a moment. "Maybe it was waiting for someone specific," he said. Eleanor looked at the cottage for a long time, at the clay panels behind the new glass, at the cedar shingles and the pointed fieldstone foundation, and the work table visible through the window, the Voss case glowing softly in the dark, holding its 150 years of careful work. She thought about the woman who had arrived here 2 years ago on a November night with a battery lantern and half a granola bar, and the very clear understanding that there was nowhere left to fall. She thought about the cold in the walls and the raccoons in the kitchen and the floor she had swept with a pine branch and the first fire she had coaxed from a rusted stove and the particular kind of anger that had kept her moving when most reasonable things would have stopped. She thought about Raymond's watch on the nail beside her bedroom door, about the address 1847 on a deed she had bought for $5, about an old man who had carved his initials into a ceiling beam and walked away from everything he knew and built something worth finding. Edmund built this house to disappear, she said quietly. I found it to reappear. The pines were still, the stars were steady. The wood smoke rose from the chimney of 1847 timber, Ridge Road in a clean straight line into the cold Vermont night, and the house that everyone had called worthless stood in its clearing exactly as it had stood for a century and a half, patient and solid and full of things worth keeping.